Sophie Martinez had always been the class clown. 17, she lived for the moments when she could make people laugh, especially when those people seemed too serious for their own good. Her friends often said she could find humor in a funeral. Though her parents worried that her need for attention would one day get her into serious trouble. That trouble arrived on a grey Tuesday morning in London during her school trip. Sophie and her classmates from Manchester had travelled to the capital to visit historical sites, and Buckingham Palace was their first stop. While her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, droned on about royal history and proper behavior, Sophie's attention wandered to the imposing figure of a royal guard, standing perfectly still near the palace gates. The guard was everything Sophie found ridiculous about authority figures. His red uniform was pristine, his black bearskin hat towered above his head, and his expression was hidden in shadow, creating an image of cold, unapproachable perfection. To Sophie, he looked like a toy soldier come to life, standing there pretending to be more important than everyone else. "Look at him," she whispered to her best friend Emma, pointing at the guard. "He thinks he's so special, standing there like a statue. I bet I could make him crack." Emma grabbed Sophie's arm nervously. "Don't even think about it, Soph. Mrs. Henderson already warned us about respecting the guards. Remember what she said about people getting arrested for bothering them?" But Sophie was already planning her performance. She had built her entire identity around being the girl who could make anyone laugh, the one who wasn't afraid to push boundaries that others respected. In her mind, this guard represented everything she rebelled against: stuffy tradition, mindless authority, and the expectation that she should be impressed by someone just because they wore a fancy uniform. The other tourists seemed genuinely awed by the guards, taking photos and speaking in hushed, reverent tones. This only made Sophie more determined to prove that these so-called protectors of the crown were just regular people playing dress-up. She had made teachers laugh during detention, had gotten her strict father to crack a smile during his most serious lectures, and had even made the grumpy school janitor chuckle with her impressions. As Sophie studied the guard more closely, she noticed he was young, probably not much older than her older brother. This made her even more confident that she could break through his professional facade. In her experience, young people always had a sense of humor hiding somewhere beneath whatever mask they were wearing. The morning crowd was beginning to thin out, and Mrs. Henderson was gathering the students to move to their next destination. This was Sophie's chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. She had spent her entire life being told she was too loud, too disruptive, too attention-seeking. Well, maybe she was all those things. But at least she wasn't boring like everyone else. Sophie stepped away from her group. Ignoring Emma's urgent whispers for her to come back, she positioned herself directly in front of the guard, close enough that he couldn't possibly ignore her presence. The guard's name was actually Thomas Wilson, though Sophie had no way of knowing this. Thomas was 22 years old and had been serving as a royal guard for just over a year. What Sophie also couldn't know was that Thomas had been having the worst month of his life. His younger sister had been diagnosed with leukemia 3 weeks earlier, and he had been spending every off-duty moment at the hospital with his family. The discipline and focus required for his duties as a guard had become both a blessing and a curse. It kept his mind occupied during the day. But it also meant he had to suppress all his emotions and fears about losing the most important person. In his world, Sophie began her performance with exaggerated marching movements, mimicking what she imagined was the guard's morning routine. She stomped her feet dramatically, threw her shoulders back in an overly military posture, and made silly faces that she was sure would crack his professional composure. Several tourists began to notice, and some even started filming her antics with their phones. "Look, everyone," Sophie announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "It's the amazing statue, man. Watch him do his incredible trick of standing completely still while the rest of us live actual lives." Thomas heard every word, but his training kept him motionless. However, inside his mind, Sophie's mocking words hit harder than she could have imagined. Sophie's performance was gaining momentum and attracting more attention than she had expected. Tourists were gathering around, some laughing at her impressions, while others looked uncomfortable with her behavior. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with being the center of attention, the the feeling that had driven her to seek the spotlight since childhood. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Sophie continued in a theatrical voice, watch as our brave soldier protects us from the terrible threat of absolutely nothing. She pretended to salute the guard, then broke into an exaggerated march around him. Her arms swinging wildly as she hummed what she thought was a military tune Mrs. Henderson had noticed. Sophie's absence from the group was now pushing through the crowd, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Sophie Martinez, get back here this instant," she called. But Sophie was too caught up in her performance to pay attention to her teacher's warnings. Emma followed Mrs. Henderson, her face pale with worry for her best friend. She had seen Sophie push boundaries before, but never like this, and never in such a public setting. The other students from their class were watching with a mixture of amusement and horror, unsure whether to be impressed by Sophie's boldness or terrified of the consequences. What none of them realized was that Thomas Wilson was fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with Sophie's mockery. As she continued her performance, his thoughts kept drifting to the conversation he had had with his sister the night before. IT-rolled Lucy had looked up at him from her hospital bed, her head bald from chemotherapy, and asked him if he was proud of his job protecting important people. "I wish I could protect you the way you protect the Queen," she had whispered, her small voice barely audible over the beeping of medical machines. Thomas had held her hand and promised her that he would always be there to protect her, even though they both knew that some battles couldn't be won with strength or courage or dedication. Sophie, oblivious to the guard's inner turmoil, escalated her performance. She began making jokes about his uniform, wondering aloud if the big hat was compensation for something. Enters in the crowd if anyone had ever seen one of these guards actually do anything useful. Her comments grew more personal and cutting. Driven by the laughter and attention she was receiving from part of the crowd, "I bet he can't even blink," Sophie announced. "What kind of person chooses to stand around all day playing dress-up instead of doing something that actually matters? It must be nice to have such an easy job." Those words cut deeper than Sophie could have imagined. Thomas had joined the Royal Guard after leaving the army, where he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He had seen combat, lost friends, and struggled with nightmares that still woke him up most nights. Discipline and honor of serving as a Royal Guard had helped him find structure and purpose after the chaos of war, and it provided the steady income his family needed to pay for his sister's medical treatments. The crowd was growing larger. Sophie was feeding off their energy. She had no idea that several people were now recording her behavior and posting it on social media in real time. She also didn't notice that some tourists were beginning to look disturbed rather than entertained by her increasingly cruel commentary. Thomas's fellow guards were aware of the situation, and they could see the tension in his posture, even if the civilians couldn't. They knew about his sister's illness, and they recognized the signs of someone being pushed beyond their breaking point. Protocol dictated that they shouldn't intervene unless there was a direct physical threat, but they were prepared to act. If necessary, Mrs. Henderson finally reached the edge of the crowd and began pushing through to get to Sophie. "Young lady, you stop this behavior immediately," she shouted, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with troublemakers for 30 years. "You're representing our school and your country, and this is absolutely unacceptable." Sophie was beyond listening to authority figures. She was drunk on attention and convinced that she was winning some kind of battle against stuffiness and tradition. In her mind, she was the brave rebel standing up to mindless authority, the free spirit refusing to be impressed by pompous displays of power. She decided to make one final, dramatic gesture that would cement her victory over the stuffy guard and give everyone a story they would remember forever. Sophie took a deep breath and prepared for what she thought would be her masterpiece of mockery. She stood directly in front of Thomas, close enough that he could hear her every word clearly, and began her final performance with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to win a game that only she was playing. "You know what I think?" Sophie said loudly, addressing both the guard and the crowd that had gathered around them. "I think this whole thing is just sad. Imagine being so desperate for respect that you dress up in a costume and pretend to be important. I bet underneath that fancy hat, you're just another nobody who couldn't make it in the real world." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, finally beginning to realize that Sophie's performance had crossed a line from playful teasing into genuine cruelty. Even some of her classmates, who had initially been impressed by her boldness, were now looking away. Embarrassed by association, Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. For months, he had been holding himself together through sheer force of will, maintaining his composure through his sister's illness, his own nightmares, and the constant pressure of his duties. Sophie's words weren't just an attack on his profession. They struck at the core of every insecurity he had been fighting since Lucy's diagnosis. Was he really just playing dress-up while his sister fought for her life? Was his job meaningless? When the one person he most wanted to protect was beyond his reach? Mrs. Henderson had almost reached Sophie when something unexpected happened. Thomas Wilson did something that royal guards are never supposed to do. He moved, not dramatically, not violently, but he turned his head slightly and looked directly at Sophie. For the first time, she could see his eyes clearly from beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. What Sophie saw in those eyes stopped her mid-sentence and wiped the smile completely off her face. She had expected to see anger, frustration, or embarrassment. Instead, she saw something that hit her like a physical force. Profound sadness mixed with a pain so deep that it seemed to come from his soul. These weren't the eyes of someone pretending to be important or playing a meaningless game. These were the eyes of someone carrying a weight that she couldn't begin to understand. For the first time in her life, Sophie Martinez was completely speechless. The crowd around them fell silent as well, sensing that something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand exactly what it was. The moment stretched on for what felt like forever. Two young people locked in a connection that neither of them had. Expected Thomas saw something change in Sophie's face as she looked into his eyes. The mockery and cruelty disappeared, replaced by confusion and the dawning realization that she had badly misjudged the situation. For a brief moment, he considered speaking, breaking every rule of his position to tell this teenager exactly what her words had done to someone who was already struggling to hold his world together. Instead, he did something even more powerful. Thomas Wilson, Royal Guard of Her Majesty, began to cry. Not dramatically, not with sobs or sounds that would draw even more attention, but with silent tears that ran down his cheeks and disappeared into the collar of his red uniform. He never broke his posture, never moved from his position. But his tears were visible to everyone who was watching. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. The laughter stopped completely, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch across the entire courtyard. Several people began to walk away, suddenly feeling like intruders. Witnessing something too private and painful for public consumption, Sophie felt her stomach drop as if she had stepped off a cliff. On all her years of pushing boundaries and seeking attention, she had never encountered a response like this. She had made people angry, frustrated, and annoyed. But she had never reduced another human being to tears with her words. The realization of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. Mrs. Henderson reached Sophie and grabbed her arm, ready to deliver a lecture that would echo through the school for years to come. But when she saw the guards, tears, and the expression of horror on Sophie's face, she too fell silent, understanding that whatever was happening here was beyond the scope of typical teenage misbehavior. Emma pushed through the crowd and reached her best friend just as Sophie began to realize the full magnitude of what she had done. Sophie stood frozen in front of Thomas, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find any words. The cruel confidence that had driven her performance just moments before had completely evaporated, replaced by a crushing sense of shame that felt heavier than anything she had ever experienced. She had never seen an adult cry because of something she had said, and the sight of this strong, uniformed man with tears on his face shattered something inside her that she didn't even know existed. Emma reached her friend. Her arm, Sophie, she whispered urgently. We need to go now. But Sophie couldn't move. She was transfixed by the guard's tears and by the horrible realization that she had caused them. For the first time in her 17 years, she understood that her words had real power to hurt people. and that the attention she craved so desperately could come at a cost that was far too high to pay. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward.
Her anger
At Sophie's behavior now mixed with concern for the guard, who was clearly struggling with something much deeper than teenage mockery. As a teacher with 3 decades of experience, she recognized the signs of someone dealing with profound personal pain. And she understood that Sophie's cruel performance had struck at wounds that were already open and bleeding. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Henderson said quietly to Thomas, speaking as one adult to another. "This student will be disciplined, and I want you to know that her behavior doesn't represent our school or our values in any way." Thomas finally moved again, this time to wipe the tears from his face with the back of his gloved hand. Spoke. His voice was quiet but clear, and every word carried the weight of months of suppressed emotion. "It's not about the mockery," he said, still looking directly at Sophie. "It's about what you said about protecting people. You're right that I can't protect everyone. There are some battles that uniforms and training and dedication can't win. But that doesn't make the trying meaningless." Sophie felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. This guard wasn't just a symbol of authority or a target for her rebellion. He was a real person with real struggles, and her need to tear him down had revealed depths of pain that she never could have imagined. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd that was still watching. "This unexpected drama unfolds. I'm sorry I didn't know." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and Sophie saw something else in his eyes now, alongside the sadness, recognition. He saw through her cruel performance to the insecure teenager underneath. Someone who had used humor and attention-seeking as armor against her own fears and uncertainties. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, his question surprising everyone within earshot, including his fellow guards who were monitoring the situation. "Sophie," she replied, her voice small and uncertain in a way that her classmates had never heard before. "Sophie, I have a little sister who's 8 years old," Thomas said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Her name is Lucy, and she's in the hospital right now, fighting leukemia. Yesterday she asked me if I was proud of my job protecting important people, and I told her I was. Not because the job makes me important, but because service to others gives meaning to everything else." Sophie felt tears beginning to form in her own eyes as the full weight of what she had done began to sink in. This man wasn't just playing, dress up, or seeking attention. He was someone's brother, someone who carried responsibilities and fears and hopes just like everyone else. Her mockery hadn't been clever or funny or rebellious. It had been cruel to someone who was already suffering. The crowd around them had grown completely silent. Many people were beginning to walk away, sensing that they were witnessing something too personal and painful for public consumption. Mrs. Henderson gestured for the other students to step back, giving Sophie and Thomas space for whatever was happening between them. "I make her laugh when she's scared," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his sister. "I tell her stories about the interesting people I meet and the funny things that happen during my duties. She thinks I'm brave because I wear this uniform, but the truth is that she's the brave one. She faces every day with more courage than I've ever had." Sophie was crying now, silent tears that matched the ones Thomas had shed moments before. She understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that her actions had consequences beyond the immediate attention they brought her. She had hurt someone who was already in pain, someone who was trying his best to be strong for the people who depended on him. "I'm sorry," Sophie said again, but this time the words carried genuine weight and meaning. "I'm really, really sorry. I was trying to be funny, but I was just being cruel. I didn't think about you as a real person with real problems, and that's horrible of me." Thomas studied her face carefully, seeing the transformation from cocky teenager to genuinely remorseful young woman. Her tears were real, her shame was genuine, and her apology came from a place of true understanding rather than simple fear of consequences. "Sophie," Thomas said gently, "can I ask you something? Why did you choose me to mock today? What was it about me that made you think I deserved to be torn down?" The question hit Sophie harder than any punishment could have. She had to confront the ugly truth about her own motivations, and the answer wasn't pretty. "I thought you looked too proud," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you were showing off, acting like you were better than everyone else." I wanted to prove that you were just pretending to be important. And why was that important to you? Thomas pressed. Not unkindly, but with the genuine curiosity of someone trying to understand. Sophie struggled to find words for feelings. She had never really examined before. Because I never feel important, she said finally. I always feel like I have to fight to get people to notice me, to prove that I matter. When I saw you standing there looking so confident and respected, I guess I wanted to bring you down to my level. The honesty in her answer surprised everyone who heard it, including Sophie herself. She had never admitted to anyone, not even Emma, how desperately insecure she felt most of the time. Or how her attention-seeking behavior came from a fear that she would be forgotten if she didn't constantly remind people she existed. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding more than Sophie could have guessed. I know what that feels like, he said. Before I joined the army, before I became a guard, I felt invisible too. I thought if I could just achieve enough, accomplish enough, maybe I would feel like I mattered. Mrs. Henderson watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 30 years of teaching, she had never seen a student receive a lesson in empathy and self-reflection quite like this. Watch. Thomas Wilson was doing something that no detention or suspension could accomplish. He was helping Sophie understand the real impact of her actions while also showing her compassion for the insecurities that had driven them. The difference is, Thomas continued, I learned that meaning doesn't come from making yourself feel bigger by making others feel smaller. It comes from finding ways to serve something larger than yourself. For me, that's my duty as a guard, my commitment to my family, and especially my promise to be strong for Lucy when she needs me to be. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara on her cheek. How do you do it? She asked. How do you stay strong when you're scared? The question was so honest and vulnerable that Thomas felt his heart ache for this teenager, who was clearly struggling with her own battles. I don't always stay strong, he admitted. Sometimes I cry, like I just did. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed and scared and angry at the world. But I've learned that strength isn't about never showing weakness. It's about getting up every day and choosing to do your best for the people who count on you, even when you don't feel like you have anything left to give. Emma had been listening to this conversation with tears in her own eyes, seeing a side of her best friend that Sophie had never revealed before. The other students were also affected, many of them recognizing their own struggles with insecurity and the desire for attention in Sophie's honest admissions. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. Sensing that the moment was reaching a natural conclusion, Sophie, I think you need to thank this gentleman for his patience and understanding, and then we need to rejoin our group. But before Sophie could respond, Thomas spoke again. Sophie, would you do something for me? Would you write a letter to my sister Lucy? She's going to be in the hospital for several more months, and she loves getting mail from young people. She especially likes hearing from girls who are brave enough to admit when they've made mistakes and learn from them. The request was so unexpected and generous that Sophie felt a fresh wave of tears. After everything she had done, this man was offering her a chance to do something positive, something that might help someone else instead of just drawing attention to herself. I would love to write to her, Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. What should I tell her? Tell her about today, Thomas suggested. Tell her about what you learned about the difference between getting attention and earning respect. Tell her about how it feels to realize that everyone you meet is fighting battles you can't see. I think she would find that very interesting. Dad. Sophie prepared to leave with her class. She realized that this encounter had changed something fundamental inside her. For the first time in her life, she had experienced the profound difference between shallow attention and meaningful connection, between tearing others down to build herself up and finding ways to lift others while growing stronger herself. 3 months later, Sophie Martinez sat at her desk in Manchester, carefully writing her 15th letter to Lucy Wilson. What had started as a single apology letter had grown into a regular correspondence that had become the highlight of both. Girls' Weeks. Lucy's letters were filled with stories about her treatment, her dreams of becoming a teacher like Mrs. Henderson, and her pride in her big brother Thomas. Sophie's letters had evolved from simple accounts of school life to thoughtful reflections on everything she was learning about herself and the world around her. The change in Sophie hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone who knew her. The desperate, attention-seeking behavior that had once defined her personality had been replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. She still had a sense of humor, still made people laugh. But now her comedy came from a place of joy rather than insecurity, and she never again used humor as a weapon to hurt others. Mrs. Henderson had watched Sophie's transformation with amazement and professional satisfaction. The girl, who had once disrupted classes and mocked authority figures, had become a leader in the school's peer counseling program, helping other students work through their own struggles with self-esteem and belonging. Sophie's honesty about her own mistakes had made her surprisingly effective at reaching teenagers who felt lost or invisible. Emma had been both relieved and proud to watch her best friend grow into someone who no longer needed to tear others down to build herself up. Their friendship had deepened as Sophie learned to share her real feelings instead of hiding behind performances designed to shock or entertain. The story of what had happened at Buckingham Palace had spread through their school, but not in the way Sophie had once craved attention. Instead of being known as the girl who had embarrassed a royal guard, she became known as someone who had learned from her mistakes and used that experience to help others. Several teachers began using Sophie's story as an example when discussing empathy and the importance of considering how our actions affect others. Thomas Wilson had returned to his duties as a royal guard, but he too had been changed by his encounter. With Sophie, her honest acknowledgement of her insecurities had reminded him that everyone, regardless of age or appearance, was fighting battles that others couldn't see. He found himself more patient with tourists, more understanding of people who seemed disrespectful or mocking, because he had learned that hurtful behavior often came from pain rather than malice. Lucy's condition had improved significantly over the months, and her correspondence with Sophie had become an important part of her recovery. The letters gave her something to look forward to during long days in the hospital, and Sophie's stories about school life helped her feel connected to the world beyond the medical center. More importantly, Sophie's journey from cruelty to compassion had inspired Lucy to think about how she could help other children who were facing serious illnesses. On a sunny Saturday morning in June, Sophie received a letter that was different from all the others Lucy had sent. This one contained an invitation that would bring the story full circle. "Dear Sophie," Lucy had written in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. "The doctors say I can leave the hospital next month. Thomas is taking me to London to celebrate, and we're going to visit Buckingham Palace so I can see where he works. Would you like to meet us there? I would love to meet my pen pal in person, and Thomas says he would like to see you again too. I want to thank you for helping me understand that sometimes the best people are the ones who make mistakes and then work hard to become better." Sophie showed the letter to her parents, who had been amazed by their daughter's transformation over the past few months. They had watched her evolve from a teenager who seemed desperate for any kind of attention into a young woman who was learning to find meaning through service to others. They readily agreed to drive her to London for this important reunion. 3 weeks later, Sophie found herself standing outside Buckingham Palace once again. But everything about the experience was different. She wasn't there to mock or perform or seek attention. She was there to meet a brave little girl who had taught her about real courage, and to see the man whose patience and wisdom had changed the entire trajectory of her life. When Lucy Wilson walked up to Sophie, supported by her big brother Thomas, Sophie was struck by how small and fragile she looked, and how bright her eyes were despite everything she had been through. Lucy was wearing a colorful hat to cover her hair, which was just beginning to grow back, and she carried a small bouquet of flowers that she had picked specifically for Sophie. "You're even prettier than I imagined," Lucy said with the directness that only children possess. "Thomas was right, you have kind eyes. He told me that people who learn from their mistakes always develop kind eyes." Sophie knelt down to Lucy's level and accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes. "And you're even braver than your letters made me think," she replied. "Thank you for teaching me what real strength looks like." Thomas watched the interaction between his sister and the teenager who had inadvertently taught him about the power of vulnerability and forgiveness. The three of them spent the afternoon together, visiting the palace grounds and talking about everything they had learned from each other. As they prepared to part ways, Lucy hugged Sophie tightly. "Promise me something," the little girl whispered. "Promise me that you'll keep helping other people learn what you learned. The world needs more people who can admit when they're wrong and then work to make things better," Sophie promised, and she kept that promise for the rest of her life. Years later, as a teacher herself, she would often tell her students the story of the day she tried to mock a royal guard and instead learned the most important lesson of her life, that true strength comes not from tearing others down but from building them up. And that the attention worth having is the kind that comes from making the world a little bit better than you found it.